Welcome to the OGV podcast. I'm your host, Loren Steffy, and our guest today is Steve Rae, who's the Executive Director for Step Change in Safety. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Loren, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join your podcast. I'm looking forward to our short exchange. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. I guess maybe a good place to start would just be, tell us a little bit about Step Change in Safety and what you do there.
Sure. So Step Change in Safety is a UK-based organisation. It's a tripartite organisation which brings together the operating community, the workforce. It also brings the unions to the table, and also the regulator, the UK HSE, sit at the same table. And we are also privileged to have the operations managers from Offshore who attend the leadership meetings as well. So we've got quite a comprehensive leadership team supported by a board of industry specialists and some from academia. So it's quite a well-founded organisation, been around for 20 plus years. And if we go back to the very beginning in 1997, the organisation was created to dramatically improve the safety performance in the North Sea back in 1997. And the vision of the leadership team at the onset was to improve safety performance by 50%, which was a pretty tall ask back in 97. And I'm pleased to say that by 2004, they'd achieved that goal. And since then, Step Change has continued to work diligently in improving safety and educational awareness around the workforce in the UK sector.
Okay. Well, it's especially timely because, here in the United States, we're passing kind of a grim anniversary, which is the 10th anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon. And obviously, you have your own experience with offshore disasters. You were one of the 61 people who survived Piper Alpha. What's it like for survivors of these kinds of accidents when these anniversaries pass? What are they feeling?
Yeah, well, hey, I've had many anniversaries to pass, 30, come up to 32 this year actually, and ironically, I feel privileged to be able to celebrate, if you call celebrate, at least recognise anniversaries as they pass, because many of my friends and colleagues have not been in that place for a long time. I tell you what it does for me, and it's different for every one of us. I know it is because I've spoken to many of those 61 who were fortunate enough that night, that it feels different for everyone. And for me, I have an overwhelming feeling of being privileged to be around still. But I always find it immensely humbling to see the amount of grief and heartache that's still associated with these anniversaries that we do. These are loved ones, husbands, brothers, sons, grandfathers who are still longed and missed after all these years. So for me, it is a very good grounding exercise, and it certainly sharpens my mind around why I'm still doing what I'm doing despite 30 plus years on. It's just such an important space to be in, offshore safety.
I read an earlier interview with you, and you said that you survived Piper Alpha because you didn't follow the rules. And I'm wondering, obviously explain a little bit what you meant by that, but more importantly, what did that experience teach you about your philosophy of safety?
Yeah, well, hey, you're quite right, and I didn't necessarily follow all the rules that night, and I guess those that survived, very few, if any, followed the rules. But for me, it became fairly obvious fairly early in that disastrous evening that the only way off that installation was going to be by the most unattractive method, which was by getting in the water without any sort of protection. And I chose to do the right thing for me at the time, which was to walk away from the team I was with and go in my own direction, do what I had to do. And fortunately, things worked out for me that night. Sadly, they didn't for many others. I didn't consciously think I was breaking any rules that night, and I think this is a very individual thing I'll talk about, in that sometimes you just know in yourself what's the right thing to do. And I knew very early on that night that the thing to do was to look after number one in as quick a way and as effective way as possible getting off the platform. So, yes, I breached all the rules. I just knew it was right for me at that night. And like I've spoke to many others who felt exactly the same way. It was choices weren't yours to make. There were consequences of not doing things rather than anything else. And how's it affected, your second part of that question was, how's it affected my approach to safety? I think certainly in my more mature years, I've been very conscious of the fact that individuals like myself have a very, very important critical role to play in their own safety. And you can look to organisations and companies to provide you with the correct PPE, the correct training and tools, but it's how you approach your work and the mindset you take into your work with you that actually makes the difference. And I think when I talk to people around safety and I do my talks on my 6 C's of safety, I talk a lot around the personal involvement rather than the tools and the competence per se. I talk about how you use those things.
Well, you mentioned the 6 C's, and that was something I wanted to get into. So why don't you go ahead and explain, kind of what those are and why they're important?
Yeah, so for many years now, God, too many to count actually, I've talked around the 6 C's. And those 6 C's, for me, represent, I would call it almost an aid memoir to how you go about your business. And if you do those things, the likelihood of success is high. And those 6 C's are, in no particular order, your control of work, how you manage the control of the work you undertake. And by that I mean around permitting, blocking off, planning, risk assessments. All those things are so important in your planning exercise. The management of change, I call it change management. It's where the C comes from. An important part about management of change is the likelihood of change within the task you're undertaking is quite high in a dynamic environment. And if you take the time to understand that there's changes in your environment, whether they be as simple as a change in your team makeup or the environment, night shift to day shift, an unforeseen occurrence of maybe a bolt head doesn't come off, those things all, in my mind, represent a change. And it's how you adapt to that change, or at least become cognizant of if something has changed and I need to reassess my environment I'm actually working in. So by change management, it's about the dynamic part of that change. I think is so important to carrying out safe work performance. So those are two. The third, again, I believe is absolutely critical, is about safety critical communication. You work in a high hazard industry, which can be quite noisy at times. How you communicate across pipe decks, drill floors, production modules, and be succinct about what you're communicating. And never be in a place where you find yourself assuming that the individuals you're working with understand what you're about to do or look at it the same way. So I would be in a place where I would always tend to over communicate rather than under communicate. So that's communication. We talk about competence. And for me, competence is much more than just doing a training course or undertaking a certificate training course. Competence is about how you use your training, how you're consistent with it, but also understanding the competence in your team. Those around you, those are part of your workforce. Are they present? Mm-hmm. Are they practicing all their competence that they have individually? That changes day to day. I talk a lot about complacency. And I think if you look at our industry right now and what we're going through with the COVID-19 situation, who could blame anyone for being distracted? Not necessarily complacent, but distracted. And distraction creates complacency in your routine tasks. So I would always encourage people when I talk to never underestimate what's going on in their minds and what's going on in the minds of their colleagues and their workforce. So again, complacency is super important for me. I talk a lot about commitment, and commitment for me is absolutely the essential ingredient in everything you do from a safety standpoint. if you're not committed to undertaking the task safely and focused, the chances are something will go awry and you'll end up with an undesirable situation. So amongst all these 5, 6 C's I've talked about now, you have to really remain committed to the task and understand why it's important to do the things you do. And if you do those 6 things, you will develop a very strong safety culture on board your asset or in your facility. And if you have a team approach to all those 6 C's, the chances are you'll develop a very strong safety culture that will protect you and your teams, because everyone will be committed, focused, they'll be communicating succinctly. You create a team environment for culture, and I think that's why I like to talk about those things. They don't necessarily talk about elements of competence or tools or risk assessments. Mm-hmm. It's the whole combination of the things you can control within your work space,
It's interesting because what you're really talking about is a combination. You're talking about a shared commitment between management and the frontline workers, the people who are at risk, on the short end of the safety spear, if you will. And I don't think, certainly here in the United States, that doesn't get as much discussion, that the two sides would work together and work toward, their shared self-interest. So it's interesting that sense of balance, that you as an individual have a role to play in making sure these operations are safe.
Absolutely. It's no secret, I started off on the tools, as we say, at the short end of the spear. I was an electrical technician offshore. I understand what doing work, picking up spanners is all about. But I've been blessed with a career that has allowed me to get into pretty lofty senior positions. And I've never lost touch with the fact that it takes both leadership, senior management, and the workforce to create that culture of a safe place of work. There is no them and us. If you're not receiving the right support and signals from your leadership team, and that absolutely includes offshore visits, it includes mentoring, it includes face-to-face. If you're not getting that, you can't expect to get a safety culture that is self-sustaining unless you have an all-embodied approach to it.
You've talked about, not wanting to feel like a victim and the importance of not feeling like a victim. What do you say to other survivors of these accidents? How can they get to that point that they don't feel like a victim?
Oh, I think we all treat things differently in our mindsets, and there's no right or wrong way to deal with those. I just know that from a very young age, I've been a very resilient individual. And as a 26-year-old, having survived that night of the 6th of July, I just knew that if I was to take this as a not so much a survivor, but a victim approach of why me, I would end up in a place that just wouldn't be healthy in the long term. And I knew that if I really wanted to make the most of my life, I had to deal with the cards that have been played to me and move beyond feeling anything like a victim. And I had sad exposure to those that unfortunately couldn't deal with that situation, and it has not ended well for them, So it's each individual will deal with it differently. I chose to take this and almost turn it into a positive influence and energy around, okay, so I've been unfortunate to be involved. I've been blessed to survive. What can I do differently to make sure it doesn't occur again? You have to turn it around on its head almost.
Absolutely. I've talked to a lot of offshore workers and obviously survivors of the Deepwater Horizon and other disasters, and many of them, they want nothing more to do with the offshore industry. And that's tough to do in Louisiana because those are good jobs. But I'm wondering, you after Piper Alpha, you really kind of refocused your efforts on the industry and making it safer. What made you feel like you could go back after what you went through?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned earlier on as a young man, as a qualified electrical engineer, if you want. I'd spent 4 or 5 years getting to that place where I'd qualified, and oil business was taking off in Aberdeen around that time. And I just saw it as being one of those things that, why would you not want a piece of that? It offered at the time, a very lucrative working schedule, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. It was well paid. It's a single man. If someone looks after you for a fortnight, feeds you, beds you, and you get paid for doing that, and then you get 2 weeks off to come and play if you wish. It was a very desirable lifestyle for a young single man. And I knew, following Piper Alpha, that there's a conscious choice to be made about, do you go back offshore? Do you put yourself back at risk? Or do you choose to do something completely different? I hedged my bets. I did some training while off on leave to ensure I had a second path, if you like, if offshore wasn't for me. But I was blessed to have a very, very supportive employer who would give me the opportunity to go back offshore on a helicopter. And I think it would have been December of that same year. And I just knew when I was amongst my colleagues from the installation I was on before I went to Piper that it just felt right. And I put that devil to bed, if you like, from an offshore helicopter point of view. And again, my employer, things line up in life. Sometimes it just feels right. And they offered me a position. It fitted what I wanted to do in my life back in the engineering side. And hey, my career progressed from there on. But I've never flinched or even thought twice about going back offshore to visit or to spend some days offshore to mentor and coach. I think if you're going to be in this business, you genuinely have to be prepared to put your feet on the steel.
Okay. In this month's issue of OGV, we have an article that compares the Piper Alpha disaster to Macondo, and I'm wondering, kind of from your own viewpoint, what do you see? Not so much in terms of the accident themselves, and how they compare, but more the aftermath, in terms of the response from the industry, the regulatory organizations. What do you see as being the differences there?
So, having lived my incident firsthand and seen Macondo secondhand, I guess I was a more experienced person when Macondo happened, far more experienced. And the thing that struck me was when Piper occurred, there was no question by the government or by anyone about what had to happen. There had to be whole-scale change. And there was an absolute commitment to have involvement of the workforce in what was going to take place following Piper, from the way we designed our regulations to being goal setting, the way we created our SI 971 regulations around elected safety reps, was all designed to engage people in becoming a much more safer industry. We had a calamitous event that affected our whole country, not just our industry. And I genuinely believe that it was a wake-up call for everyone involved, plus the extended community globally, to, okay, this is real. We're really playing with hydrocarbons at depth here. We really need to do something different. Mm-hmm. If I think about the Macondo incident, again, sadly, lives lost. I'm well aware of that. I genuinely believe that Macondo was seen far more as an environmental disaster rather than the loss of life. I think the pursuant claims of loss of earnings, interest, livelihood, and so on and so forth far exceeded the ability of the regulator and the community to actually look internally at what had happened and why. I think, having read the incident report on Macondo and many times, and also the Piper one, distinct similarities around how the work had been approached from a cultural and a control point of view. Mm-hmm. And that should never have been the case. I think I don't think any regulatory system is perfect. I think many of them are blunt instruments. I think a goal-setting regime allows you to test against companies' own barriers rather than a compliant, blunt instrument. And I genuinely think that should have been a moment for the community in the Gulf, if not the whole US, to go, okay, so what could we really take on board that we didn't take on board the last time when Piper happened? Because I still think there were some things around the involvement of the workforce, about how you engage people at the community level were missed. Were missed in the US, and sometimes I think they're still missing today. Actually, I spent some years working there, as you know, and one of the hardest things I found was to get the regulators, the employing companies, to understand how important it was to get the workforce to the table in a meaningful manner. And I think that's the difference. I think we have here, not perfect, but we have a fully engaged industry. I don't think that exists yet in the US.
Well, it's interesting because you have a lot of the same companies that operate in the US and the UK, and yet it seems like they operate differently in response to the regulatory regimes.
They do, and I think that's there's, as the terminology goes, there's many ways to skin a cat. And if your cat is fit for purpose in one area and it's not in the other, you'll find ways to not circumvent it, but you'll find ways that you manage your business differently. And there's not one set of regulations fits this global industry, but I think there are some that are missing, that would make for a more respective sort of regime.
After Macondo happened, we did see some new regulations that were put into effect in the U.S. Everything from a lot of stuff around the BOP design, BOP redundancy, and that kind of thing. Some of those regulations are now they haven't been rolled back yet, but there's discussion of rolling them back. The administration's looking at rolling them back. Do you have any concerns about that, or did the industry go too far, or did the regulatory regime go too far in response to the accident?
So I know, through having worked in the drilling fraternity for long enough, that what most people talked about with the Macondo response to regulations was around the well control envelope. Hence why I said they were seen as an environmental disaster rather than anything else. And I genuinely believe that some of those additional regulations around design, redundancy, and so on went way beyond possibly the realms of practicality. Let's call it practicality, Loren. And I remember talking to some manufacturers of BOP equipment going, man, they've made this almost impossible to build. It's going to be super expensive, and it's not about the money. And it's going to have so much redundancy. How do you actually install equipment that becomes so heavy and so cumbersome to install and so many resistant assets? So I think, if I can be honest, I think perhaps maybe on the design side and the redundancy side, the regulations went slightly too far. But I think they missed the whole trick around the things I just talked about: control of work, management of change. I don't necessarily recognize any particular changes to that area. I know SENS came in. SENS, again, is a fairly blunt instrument. I think the trick was missed about not just the equipment, but the actual process that keeps you safe while using equipment.
We're now entering, we have been in for the last several months, an environment of very low oil prices. Does that raise any concerns about the impact on safety? I mean, I know no company would ever say they're deliberately cutting back on safety, but it seems like when the industry gets under financial pressure, those are kind of some areas that get squeezed. Does that raise any concerns for you?
I think we would be naive as an industry if we didn't think there were potential increase in vulnerability around this whole low commodity price. And I've talked often about the vulnerability that creeps into our business, not necessarily because the operating companies won't spend the money. That's not necessarily the issue. I think the issue is that you lose a lot of what I would call unwritten competence and knowledge, because those people that leave the industry, everyone that leaves this industry leaves with something in their head that's just a piece of magic that makes things work. So that's why I get back when I talk about vulnerability in the second breath, I talk about my 6 C's, because what stops you, or let's say mitigates your vulnerability, is ensuring that you have your 6 C's lined up. And I'm absolutely certain that if an employee or a group of employees raised a concern around a piece of equipment or an investment decision on a piece of equipment or plant, that the right decision would be made. But you have to be prepared to accept that there'll be change, and you have to control that change. So the vulnerability for me is a around the loss of the knowledge, the experience, the, let's call it the potential to extend your maintenance and inspection regimes. Those are the things I would be really concerned around at this present time.
We talked a little bit earlier about the COVID-19 virus and the effect that that's having. But I'm wondering, you mentioned the distraction that it can pose, but I'm wondering if there are any unique safety issues around something like this. The industry hasn't really dealt with the pandemic in this way. I mean, we've had a number of workers here in the Gulf. There's been some in the North Sea that have tested positive. How do companies respond to that, and how does that differ from other safety concerns in the past?
Yeah. So, we talked about control of work, and we talked about goal setting regulations, and as part of our regulatory sort of regime here, we have to have response measures for, call them pandemics if you wish, but they're outbreaks of a hygiene nature or whatever you want to do. And what I've come to understand it, many of these have really been tested to the nth degree, and typically you could have a cure, or you could have a vaccination that might deal with some of those. But right now we're dealing with something that is uncurable still. And I think two things that have really not helped our situation and how we deal with it. One is there's been a degree of or a lack of detail around what is classed as essential workers and how we manage those essential workers. And I think the other one is that there is, to a degree, been a lot of, what's the best way? There's a lack of understanding of what's right and what's wrong from a precautionary point of view. I think one of the biggest things we're seeing here is about people having to fly in helicopters still, and social distancing is supposed to be 2 meters and so on. I think, the measures are in place, and I know every day companies are introducing something else as they learn and adapt. So I think you're right, Loren, we've never had to deal with a pandemic as such. It's a dynamic situation. I talk about things on a daily basis with senior people in this industry. You get out of bed the next morning and they've changed. It's so dynamic, and I think it's good that we're reacting so quickly, but we're not there yet. And I think as and when mitigating measures become available, like testing that can be validated and so on and so forth, we'll put these in place. And that will allow us to give greater confidence to our workforce, and not only our workforce, our family at home, because they have to read what they read in the press and the media. And it's typically not a good story right now. So I think we have to understand the fact, understand where the risks are, and understand that everyone's doing their best to make good of a situation that's very dynamic, and it requires us all, again, from leadership, supply chain, and the workforce, to practice what we know works. High levels of hygiene, as best we can, from screening. Don't take the risk of, do you think you've got a fever? Do you think you've got a cough? Do I need my income more than I need to take the chance? There's a high risk around that whole, and we talk about complacency and commitment. They fit right in that space. So I talk about lots of things. I think you can always tie them back to one of my 6 C's about commitment to keep safe. If you really think you may have a slight high temperature or you have a cough, don't go. And I think that's the individual response. Companies are doing what they can in a very dynamic area, and we'll get there. But I would imagine our response plans will change as a result of this, and hopefully that will be soon. We will be able to get on top of this soon. But very dynamic situation indeed, yeah.
One of the questions that I get asked a lot with regards to Macondo is, is the Gulf safer now than it was a decade ago, safer to operate in? But I'd like to ask you the same question, but on a broader scale. Do you think that offshore safety is improving, and what still needs to be done?
So I genuinely think that we have the broadest measure, we have a far more safety aware and conscious industry. I think what we have to recognize, because nothing stands still, the people that initiated this industry and brought it to where it got to 10 years ago predominantly came from engineering backgrounds, physical, practical engineering backgrounds. They understood risk. They understood working with heavy equipment. I think you'll find now that as the younger generations come into our industry, they think differently. They've been educated differently. Typically in the UK, they'll not have worked in heavy industry. They won't necessarily appreciate the risks and dangers and the hazards that are presented to them in the same way that an older generation would have. So we have to be cognizant that we have to change our approach to how we educate them around risk perception, and working collectively on a very sort of high hazard industry. So in summary, I think we are in a better place. We've much more barriers in place. We understand where the risks are, but it's a workforce that's evolving and changing all the time. So it's now what we're needed now. You ask me what I think we need to get to that next step. We need to go back to behaviours and culture, because that changes when generations change. Equipment doesn't change in culture, but people's behaviours and attitudes change. So again, get back to the 6 C's. Think about how do we educate our young ones, our emerging engineers, to develop a strong safety culture. That's where I think the biggest prize is, if you like.
Okay. Well, Steve, we're about out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for taking the time to interview me, and I hope it's been insightful for you. I've certainly enjoyed it. Thank you. Have a lovely day.
We've been talking with offshore safety expert Steve Rae. For OGV, I'm Loren Steffy. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to OGV Podcasts. For more energy podcasts, energy news, TV, events, and much more, visit www.ogvenergy.co.uk.